this story comes out of Indiana. Incredible. You've got a coalition of radical transgender activists and left-wing extremists and their allies in the fake media. They are really, 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 really mad, and they want you to know they're super duper mad about a bill that would protect children from being castrated and having their genitals mutilated or electrocuted by quacks in doctor costumes. They call these things gender-affirming care. But of course, this is really just brutal and horrific abuse of children. So supporters of this bill say it's common sense. It's a HB 1118, and it prohibits healthcare providers, so-called, from offering to castrate children, or from actually castrating children, from giving mastectomies, cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, and various other forms of surgical genital mutilation. And anyone caught violating the law could, in theory at least, face felony child abuse charges and even civil liability up to 20 years later. So if a child is mutilated and then 19 years later decides that they regret that decision, then under this law, these children or maybe even their parents would be able to sue them and recover damages. So I talked to the head of Purple for Parents Indiana, a very nice lady named Rhonda Miller. And she says that this is important because it protects children. She actually says, because there's a number of these bills introduced in Indiana this session, but she says this is the only one that's comprehensive and that addresses the transgender issue from school counselor to the surgeon. Here's what she told me. She said, "We believe it's imperative that we protect minors from decisions with lifelong consequences when studies show that brain development is not capable of realizing the long-term effects of surgically altering one's body." And so Rhonda has been really active in these things, and she's passionate about this in terms of protecting children. She also pointed out that if you look at the suicide rate data among children who have had their genitals mutilated and things, it actually doesn't decrease after these surgeries. There's been a lot of research in Europe. She actually pointed to a 2020 Dutch study warning doctors about the harm based on the mental health data that was coming out. And then Sweden, one of the most progressive countries in the world, has actually suspended gender transitions of children, except within clinical trials, because they were finding so many negative effects. I also got some comments from the bill's sponsor, Representative Larissa Sweet, and she called this an attack on our children, that this is a major topic of discussion in Indiana, not just the people were asking her about on the campaign trail, but just in everyday conversation. She says this is what people are talking about. She said that protecting children was her promise. It's one of her top priorities. And she said this legislation is just one of the ways that she can help protect children in the state. She also pointed out quite correctly that brains are not fully developed until about age 25. Obviously, that's why we don't let children drink or smoke or drive or vote or any of those other things, because they can't really comprehend these things. They don't necessarily make good decisions. And obviously, mutilating your genitals in a way that is going to prevent you from ever being able to have children, from ever being able to have a biological family, that's a very serious decision. And she also pointed out that other countries have scaled this back, where they've been further down the line here than the United States has been. So yeah, it's a really interesting bill. She says this bill stops the pipeline of transitioning children that starts in schools and ends up on a surgical table. She says we owe it to this generation to keep them from being exposed to these experiments with lifelong detrimental effects. I mentioned that there was a lot of these bills introduced all across the country. Actually, there's been obviously an epidemic of children being mutilated with these gender transitions. Just in the last year or so, more than a half a dozen states have banned these procedures for children. And obviously, the crowd, the LGBT crowd, is very upset, and so are their allies in the big pharma-funded special interest groups like the ACLU. The ACLU of Indiana Advocacy says we're going to use every tool at our disposal to stop this. Katie Blair, her name, didn't mention that ACLU gets big funding from the big pharmaceutical giants and interests that profit off of this horror. But she did say these are attack bills that are part of a hate-driven campaign. She didn't actually say what was so hateful about it. But you know what, folks? The fact that we're even having this conversation, the fact that we even have to talk about legislation to prohibit doctors from chopping off private parts from children is insane. It's absolutely monstrous that we're even having these discussions. Frankly, I think it's important that lawmakers protect these kids, but it's even more important that parents start protecting these kids now, right? Rachel Levine, Assistant Secretary of Health, wants to chop off genitals without parental permission, wants to silence people online who point out the evil of this. is. And so, folks, we've got to do something. And kudos to lawmakers in Indiana.